David, the weather's getting nicer in New York, but today we're going to be talking about not so much the weather, but the weathermen. How are you this morning in British Columbia, this afternoon in New York?
A little humid, a little wet, but otherwise everything is good, Jason.
Excellent. Now, David, I have to say, before you brought up the weathermen, and we're talking, of course, about Bernadine Dohrn, Bill Ayers, I didn't really know about them, I don't think at all. I mean, perhaps I've heard of them, but definitely had no idea about their activities involving bombing the Pentagon, bombing the Capitol building, their dedication to really wanting to destroy America. And it's shocking news. People who were alive and adults in the 1960s, of course, probably remember, but of course, I wasn't even born at the time they were most active, and just a really young child when they were, allegedly dismantled, which many believe they never were. Now, I think it's come back around in the research that you've done and that you and I share on the various programs that we do. I do want to remind everyone that they can see the full story. They're really only getting part of it if they're watching us on Wednesdays here on YouTube and the various other platforms that we're on. But it's really important that people go to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, your Patreon page, of course, and support you and follow the broadcasts that we do every Friday. We've recently added John Carmen, and John was he was a Secret Service agent, he was a U.S. Customs and Border Protection agent, and he's adding quite a lot to the show. He'll be with us again on Friday, but people can see those episodes on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I also want everyone to know about your Twitter account, which is still relatively new. You're on Twitter at CSI Hawkins, and people can follow your tweets and various updates about the program and the research that you're doing. So I want to make sure everyone knows about all this. Now, with regard to the weathermen, they were obviously a group of radicals dedicated to the destruction of the United States, the re-education of the people of the United States. They were dedicated to Marxist, communist values, people like Saul Alinsky and this kind of thing. And the key figures, Bernadine Dohrn and Bill Ayers, never went to jail for the bombings, the killings, the domestic terrorism that they were involved in. Bernadine Dohrn, of course, served 9 months in jail for refusing to testify before a grand jury, but never did she meet justice for the destruction that she brought on law enforcement personnel. They were dedicated to the destruction of the military. It's really quite disturbing. And as you've pointed out to me, they're now on faculty at distinguished universities. Bill Ayers at the University of Illinois in Chicago and Bernadine Dohrn at Northwestern University. You've drawn so many connections, really troubling connections, to some of the activities that they could have been and could still be involved in at these universities. And it causes us to, I think, have to examine these things further and really ask some important questions. Now, before we get into the details of what we're going to discuss today, there's been a lot of news this morning. I just noticed that the mystery of the Boeing 737 MAX 8 crashes has been sort of reinvigorated. I may have discussed this in the past, but before we ever met and before I started Crowdsource the Truth, I was an avid follower of a TV program called Air Crash Investigations, and there are a number of NTSB investigators that participate in that program who I now follow on social media. I don't think the show is on anymore. And one of them had posted yesterday or the day before that he was perplexed that the NTSB hadn't been brought into these investigations. As you pointed out, a French body, I believe, was investigating the crash data, And this is unusual because even though the crash happened outside the United States, because it involved Boeing aircraft, it would be standard practice for the NTSB to be involved. Now, there are some individuals around the internet who like to immediately jump to conclusions and point to certain elements of evidence that they consider conclusive proof and definitive answers. I find that problematic, particularly when the investigation hasn't completed. And just this morning, we see that new information seems to reveal that the pilots did in fact follow the procedure for correcting the nose-down attitude of the aircraft, but on 4 occasions, the software took over and was basically fighting with the pilots. So this remains a mystery. What do you think about this, David?
Well, that's consistent with the idea that these systems have been abused or embedded with artificial intelligence, expert system, or fuzzy logic algorithms, in which I happen to be an expert, having been working in this area for about 30, nearly 40 years. And what appears to have happened is that they've created, this is the Weathermen and what we call, as you know, the evil teachers. Evil standing for the Electronic Visualization Laboratory at the University of Illinois, Chicago, which is accessed by teachers. They didn't necessarily be evil, of course, but it's a wonderful opportunity to simulate events that then go from simulation to rogue attacks where people die in large numbers. So anyone who has access to that evil facility at the University of Illinois, Chicago, such as, I guess, over decades, William Ayers, and Bernadine Dohrn, his wife, who's at the, or was at the University of Northwestern University. I think she's retired now. And she gave seminars on torture paradigms and practice. So the Weathermen organization was never dismantled. It actually was reinforced and encouraged and supplied with some very sophisticated equipment in what I have called the Con Air Patents for Rent, Murder for Hire network that was created, I believe, by the UK, this company called Serco, that has allowed people like Bernadine Dohrn and Bill Ayers to mentor disingenuous creatures, if that's the right description, such as Barack Hussein Obama and Michelle Obama, who were, I think, at the University of Chicago, preaching their magical destruction of the United States. So you've got an extraordinarily powerful signals intelligence organization which has been tunneled, right? And just to address this guy, Mr. Sweigert, right? I mean, he describes himself as an ethical hacker. It's not a term that I would apply because I have problems with people who hack ethically because I don't know quite whose ethics they're promoting.
Right.
But someone like Sweigert, for example, would be able to tunnel from one organization into another, and hence that extraordinary patent for split tunneling, which creates 3 communities. And I think we have to remember, Jason, that these people describe themselves as community organizers. Saul Alinsky was a community organizer who had this bright idea of rubbing raw the sores of discontent. And of course, so if you're black and you need some sores rubbed to make you anti-white or vice versa, you're meat and potatoes for people like Alinsky. Well, he mentored a number of people, obviously. One of the people who he mentored was Hillary Clinton. Of course, I think he was dead by the time Obama crawled into the network. But Obama, I think, described himself as a community organizer.
Correct.
Now, I don't know if Sweigert is a community organizer, but let's look at the communities that kind of get spun off by the split tunnel patent. It's an extraordinary, I think it might be the most powerful patent in terms of our ability to unravel this conspiracy. And I think I introduced you to the term common purpose this morning.
Yes.
That's a sort of common law notion that if you combine together for a criminal common purpose, even if you don't pull the trigger or stab with the knife, if you join together with the group can be held responsible as members of this organization. The equivalent in the UK in the United States is RICO, Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization. But I firmly believe now that the communities that have come under the label of this split tunnel patent can be described as a racketeering, influenced, and corrupt organization in the domestic United States and a common purpose criminal organization under international law. So let's look at the communities that get split off by this split tunnel facility in terms of organized crime and events at a crime scene that actually prevent the crime from being solved. So obviously one community that would be really objectionable from the point of view of the conspirators would be on the Federal Bridge, where you have the state of Illinois beside the Department of Justice, beside Veterans Affairs. Now, these clowns apparently seem to think that we are against veterans just because we identify a number of veterans that appear to have been caught up in this, what I would call, common criminal purpose. But of course, that's not the point. I think the veterans are targets for attack from people like this, as is the state of Illinois, which unfortunately has the reputation of being the most corrupt state in the Union, and Chicago being the most corrupt city. So they've got a number of handicaps. And of course, the Department of Justice, where there are organizations within the Department of Justice, such as DOJ Pride, that again, I believe, are targets for entrapment, blackmail, and extortion. But anyway, we're talking about tunnels.
Well, David, can I address what you're saying about veterans for a moment? Because that is a recurring theme in what they like to say about you and I. I don't know if I've revealed this before, but my own father is a veteran, and of course I love him and respect the work that he did in the Navy. We've got other veterans who appear on the show, Scott Bennett. It's quite interesting how Scott is attacked by this same group, but we don't accuse them of hating veterans. And we've heard quite a lot from Mr. Sweigert, how he considers himself a whistleblower. Scott Bennett is also a whistleblower, again being attacked. Mr. Sweigert has sued the CIA, which, I don't know, perhaps that's, going against the government, but he's also sued the Department of the Army. Now, his lawsuit against the CIA was dismissed, and the Department of Justice, in their pleadings, said that his claims had no basis, he had no standing, and it was dismissed. So I wonder, is it possible that Mr. Sweigert is a disgruntled veteran? He's told us about how he was captured by the Sandinistas, and when I asked him if that meant that he was involved in Iran-Contra, certainly criminal activity executed by members of the military, he got angry about that. I wonder how long he was in that room with the boa constrictor that the Contras tortured him with. According to his own words, I have no knowledge beyond what he's publicly told us. And certainly if you had experienced the types of things that Mr. Sweigert had, his veteran father locking him in the basement to sleep on newspapers with dog excrement, being rejected by his own father. He's told us about how his brother, George, was favored as a basketball star. Perhaps he joined the military to get some degree of acceptance. And I wonder how long he was in that Sandinista prison with the snake. And I wonder how that might make you feel about an Air Force that failed to rescue you and then caused you to sue the United States government, to sue the Department of the Army. Perhaps Mr. Sweigert has been turned to a person who hates the U.S. government and wants to destroy it in the way that Bernadine, Dohrn, and Bill Ayers have dedicated their lives. And I think it's important, David, for us to reiterate that article in the New York Times on September 11th, 2001, in which Bill Ayers said he doesn't regret setting off bombs. How could he have said something like that on September 11th? The New York Times must be printed well before 8 a.m. And this article, in order for it to appear in the New York Times on September 11th, it had to be written well before. I would say this opening line of this "no regrets for a love of explosives" in a memoir of sorts, this was published on September 11th, 2001, Ayers says, "I don't regret setting bombs." It's almost suggestive of foreknowledge, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And there was a lot of foreknowledge amongst various people before 9/11. I just, as an aside, I think I'd feel more sympathy for the boa constrictor in the room with David Sweigert, given his capacity for spreading, unmentionable. Well, anyway, I digress. Anyway, I'm sure that the boa constrictor is long gone if it tackled any part of Sweigert's anatomy. So let's move on to this split tunnel formula, which
David,
I think.
What was the title of that patent for the split tunneling? TDS, was that it?
That's it. That's
okay.
it. I think you got it. Oh no, that's TDM. Sorry, it escapes me the title at the moment. But there are words in it where you break off the communities in each of the three legs of a split tunnel into components that can be safely said to prevent a crime scene being properly investigated and the perpetrators being identified. The most important community within a tunnel to be deprived of the data and evidence necessary to solve the crime would, of course, be the Federal Bridge members, which include the Department of Justice, the State of Illinois, and Veterans Affairs. Less so the State of Illinois, which is a corrupt state, and Veterans Affairs, which is obviously a victim. But the Department of Justice has an obligation, I presume, under its various arms, United States Marshals, FBI, Department of Justice programs, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, and the Attorney General's office, I think, or offices of the Attorney General. They have the duty to look at crimes and, in particular, I believe, preserve the chain of custody of data and evidence needed to solve the crime. And what's happened with these split tunnel techniques, the Department of Justice has been unable to preserve the chain of custody for major crimes, including the attack on the Pentagon, which had been in 1972 attacked by the Weatherman, no coincidences, because outside the Pentagon, about 15 minutes after impact of whatever it was that hit the Pentagon, we can come to that in a minute, there's a line of people wearing FBI T-shirts, which doesn't necessarily mean that they work with the FBI. They might have been a Con Air team sent in to pretend to be the FBI. Anyway, they're picking up evidence of what was on the Pentagon lawn, sort of fairly small bits of evidence, and popping it in a brown paper bag and taking it away from the crime scene. That's a felony.
Well,
it's
of course,
violation.
and sorry to interrupt, David, but again, we don't presume that the FBI would never investigate the crime scene. What we're questioning is the deviation from standard procedure. And of course, when we looked at those photographs with John Carmen, who's very familiar with law enforcement procedures, he said it's absolutely outside of the realm of standard procedure to pick up pieces of an airplane without gloves, getting fingerprints on it, corrupting the crime scene. That's what we're questioning.
And so let's look at a few other famous crime scenes where evidence has clearly been taken away. And let me remind people that that is we the people, Americans, Brits, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, under common law countries, we're entitled to make an aggressive inference of guilt against anyone who's taking evidence away from a crime scene that precludes the possibility of solving the crime. Like what bits are those guys taking away? Were they planted before the crime, the attack on the Pentagon, or after? Now let's take the pig farm and the raid on Starnet Communications. And let's just think, maybe that will help people think in terms of the hypothesis that there is a Con Air, patents for rent, murder for hire network that exists in the world today that dates back in terms of its basic structure to World War II and possibly further back than that, where you basically deploy a bunch of criminals or criminalized people for example, Bernadine Dohrn, right? She spent 9 months in jail for refusing to declare who was behind the bombing attack, where I think one of her friends died and she's adopted the child, or was it the Brinks robbery or whatever. So Bernadine Dohrn would be a classic example of a individual that would be extremely useful if you wanted to remove evidence from a crime scene that would otherwise lead to the solution of the crime. Right? And Bill Ayers is the same. If you take the raid on Starnet Communications, what was said, this was on the 20th of August of 1999 in Vancouver, where I believe these systems were developed outside the reach of RICO, Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization, and the arm of the FBI, because it's a nice haven for organized crime in Canada. Because in 1970, when they introduced the murder for hire legislation, I think in the United States, the really serious hoods and psychopaths and killers, well, they came into Canada, but Canada, you can get a slap on the wrist for this stuff. Anyway, what was taken away from 3 floors of 425 Carroll Street, the first 3 floors, was all of the computers and servers and files and information and evidence and data associated with what was alleged to be a child pornography, a hardcore pornography, and an online gaming network. So my question is, where did it go? Well, the question is, who took it? Well, I don't think the RCMP or the Vancouver police took it. I think the SWAT teams sent from the United States took it. That is the IRS and the customs. Right? So now, where would that have gone? But what I'm saying is, there they broke the chain of custody of crimes deemed to be associated with child and hardcore pornography, and I'm talking snuff films, and online gaming.
Right.
Now, it seems to me this network of people who I would describe as the social engineering arm of that triple tunnel facility or patent, what they're trying to do is say that we are accusing people who are innocent of these kind of crimes. I think what we're really saying is they're breaking the chain of custody, and in particular, if they break the chain of custody and that's deemed to be spoliation, we, you, me, our listeners, are entitled to an aggressive inference of guilt. So if we find David Sweigert, the ethical hacker, is breaking the chain of custody of data and evidence associated with the 9/11 attack, then I think it would be legitimate to say we're making an inference about his association with the 9/11 attack, which is perfectly justified because he's broken the chain of evidence that we need to solve the crime. So, David, of course, if he's expected, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but I've just discovered something possibly remarkable. Now, I'm sorry, but this just came up here. So you've told us about how the murders at the Picton Pig Farm were mostly First Nations prostitutes. This is the Google Earth map of, 425 Carroll Street, where Starnet Communications was located and where that raid occurred. And so this building here is 425 Carroll Street, this sort of oddly shaped building. And then we've got this right here, which has what certainly looks like some sort of Native American, or in this case, Native Canadian. What are we looking at here? Do you know what this is?
Well, that's obviously a mural and a First Nations mural. And that community in the downtown east side is incredibly vulnerable, Jason, right? And it's a natural target for people like, the Bill Ayers, Bernadine Dohrn, because these are the people who can be abducted and then disappeared in the most cruel fashion. And remind ourselves that Bernadine Dohrn lectures on torture paradigms and practice. And what you get, of course, is intellectual property controlled by a racketeering, influenced, and corrupt organization. And it's no coincidence that when that material was confiscated in the raid of the 20th of August, 1999, it must have gone into the custody of people who are practiced at looking after intellectual property. And it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that 2 of these evil teachers, Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton, they're both teachers. I mean, I think Michelle Obama was at the University of Chicago Medical Hospitals as vice president of community relations on $315,000 a year, which is not bad, for a woman of her caliber, if that's the right term. And Hillary Clinton, of course, was the first female partner at Rose Law, and she was in charge of intellectual property, or the development of intellectual property, for various clients, including BEI BEI Industries, that was the owner of the patent for the QRS-11 gyro chip that appears to have guided the planes on 911 into their targets. So again, you've got this community, extraordinary community, that is able to remove evidence and data from a crime scene so that it makes it impossible for the crime to be solved. So now the FBI, I think, was a target for this. The FBI has never been given access to the chain of custody that would give them access to the evidence needed to solve the crime in these events, like out at the pig farm. The Murrah building would be another classic example. The founder of Conair is Christine Marcy, Phil McConnell's sister. She effectively founded 3 organizations in the mid-1980s that are germane to our inquiry. One is the database for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The other is the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund with Eric Holder, which she ran, I believe, for decades, giving her access to vast amounts of money confiscated from suspects, etc. And the other is Conair, or the full name of that is the United States Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System. With those 3 networks, you can create, in my opinion, a global Conair patents for rent, murder for hire network that has actually morphed from the Weathermen of the 1970s into the evil teachers of the present time. Over to you.
Yeah, and I would also add, David, that, our show is centrally focused on examining these very famous but unsolved crimes. And certainly, if the crimes are not solved with traditional crime scene investigation techniques, well, they say that necessity is the mother of invention. So you've invented some rather unconventional crime scene investigation techniques, and if the crimes are unsolved, why should you or I be prevented from attempting to solve these crimes and putting forward hypotheses? Obviously, when we lack a confession or a video recorded document of how a crime was done, an investigator must form a hypothesis based on evidence. And I think it's very important that we don't jump to conclusions. Certainly today's new information about the Boeing 737 MAX 8 crashes and the fact that it's being investigated by an investigative body that seems more closely associated with Airbus than Boeing is curious at very least, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, totally. And so just to go over what I've done, with my background in artificial intelligence and expert systems and the work that I did in the 1980s on developing decision support for human beings, the way I think we can attack unsolved crimes where the evidence has been removed or is being withheld or has been planted or modified is actually to use the same tools. For example, the electronic visualization laboratory in Chicago, and I think there's an outfit called Mechdyne that has the license for the evil cave. That's cave automated virtual environment, and go into a crime scene in our imagination and simulate the theory of the crime and see if it honors the empirical data observed at the crime. So, for example, I would say to Mr. Sweigert, who apparently is an Air Force veteran, can he explain the tunnel that appears to have been punched through the Pentagon through 8 reinforced walls, where the prime contractor was AMEC, which is a British company, amazingly enough, on the Pentagon renovation project, where AMEC's headquarters in North America were in the building below the ground, or the 3 floors of which were occupied by Starnet, the company allegedly to have engaged in child and hardcore pornography and online gaming that was raided by the police. So, Mr. Sweigert, maybe you could take your head out of where the sun doesn't shine and stop worrying about whether or not I have a degree from Cambridge or a foundation, or Jason Goodman is a good guy or a bad guy, and determine whether or not there's a possibility the theory of the bomb hoax at the port of Charleston was actually planted by your brother. Because I think, Jason, I think you can support that theory. But more important, let's go back to 911. You, Mr. Sweigert, would have had the knowledge as an ethical hacker to tunnel into the Federal Bridge and create certificates that would allow the protege companies of Boeing and Lockheed Martin to organize the red team attack on 911, while the mentors at Lockheed Martin and Boeing were actually stood down by the revocation of their certificates through an Entrust patent, where you ought to know that actually when you thought you were working for Entrust, you were actually working for Entrust's major shareholder, which is Nortel, which has now gone bust because people like you destroyed Nortel and the crown jewels of Canadian technology. And you should do a little more research. There's a term actually coined, I think, from a 17th century mathematician called Blaise Pascal, Jason. Mm-hmm. And Blaise Pascal said, we have a moral obligation to think hard. I love that phrase. I taught my son that. I believe I endeavor to do the best I can in terms of that. But it doesn't matter, Mr. Sweigert and your friends, what your IQs are, and I'm not making any snide remarks about what your IQs are. You have a moral obligation to think hard. So 3,000 of your countrymen, or almost 3,000 of your countrymen, were slaughtered on 911 with a very elaborate attack on the command and control systems of the United States from within. So you talk about glibly red team and blue team games, and you do this bizarre camera work, and you're pointing at some grass, and your pretty kitty is running along, and you've got this
prepper kitty,
right? And you've got this finger stuff and talking about David Hawkins and so on. Well, that doesn't terrify me. It doesn't impress me, actually. It suggests that you have a number of challenges, intellectual challenges, but most importantly, Mr. Sweigert, you have a moral obligation to think hard. And you and your colleagues in this social engineering fraternity that appears to be fully obsessed with the idea of scrubbing internet sites that you find objectionable, and you're attempting to do that kind of thing with a number of people, maybe you've succeeded. You're not going to succeed with this because I've coined the phrase, the truth is a juggernaut and the rest is mud on the road. So if you want to continue to be mud on the road, well, you're just going to have to pay the price. Over to you, Jason.
You know, David, there's another guy, as you talk about scrubbing the internet, I don't know if I've spoken to you about this guy before, but, you know, through the 2-year process, we're coming up on 2 years that David Sweigert and his band of merry men have been so dedicated to making videos every day, watching every single video that I produce, maligning my guests, bringing lawsuits. It's an amazing display of dedication. It's hard to imagine that an adult would have so much time on their hands and such a grudge to hold that he could dedicate this amount of effort and energy to doing this. I mean, I think I've said this many times. There are websites that talk about, you know, the earth being flat and all kinds of things that they could be busy refuting, but they are intent on refuting the things that you and I say. In my opinion, they seem to be failing persistently, but there's a guy who's on YouTube by the name of China3 who also caught on to the fact that David Sweigert is a pretty persistent liar, maybe even pathological, and he produced a number of videos exposing that. Sweigert dedicated himself to pushing that guy off the internet. There's another guy named Jesse Potts, or spots. I spoke to Jesse 2 weeks ago. I apologize, Jesse, if I'm forgetting your name, but seems a kind fellow, and he told me that he was threatened with lawsuits and it just became too difficult for him to press on, so he gave up, effectively scrubbed from the internet. So there's this persistence that they have that in and of itself draws attention to what they're doing. It seems to me if someone gets into kind of a dispute with somebody online, perhaps there's a few comments back and forth, maybe it ruins your day, you get angry, but to spend 2 years on this, it's conspicuous in and of itself. Now, there's another thing that you've brought to my attention that we've included in today's collage. It's an interesting item that I sort of can't believe that I was unaware of, given its close proximity to where I am right now, and it's a very distinctive thing. This is, of course, the Cornfield cruiser, which you've brought to my attention. What can you tell us about this thing, David?
Well, this is a really interesting bit of technology. And originally, the Aegis combat system, let me just read from Wikipedia. The Aegis combat system is an American integrated naval weapons system developed by the Missile and Surface Radar Division of RCA and now produced by Lockheed Martin. So let's look at that a little bit.
Yeah.
RCA, of course, RCA GB 1929 now became Serco in 1988-89, where it was the subject in 1988 of a management buyout. This is in the United Kingdom. And in 1989, it had an IPO where it took on the most bizarre group of shareholders, I think, of any company with defense implications, including, for example, 3 sovereign states, that is to say, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore. Well, that's pretty critical because Saudi Arabia is accused of harboring the mussel hijackers that came through Dubai. 2 very interesting pension funds that I believe lead back to the Weathermen. The UK arm of that would be the University's Superannuation Scheme, and the American arm would be the Teachers Insurance Annuity Association. Now, the University's Superannuation Scheme in the United Kingdom is the largest private pension fund in the United Kingdom. The Teachers Insurance Annuity Association is the largest private pension fund in the world, with over $1+ trillion of assets under management, with major shareholdings in companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. Now, when you have these big institutional shareholders, they have enormous influence about which directors get elected and which directors get excluded. One of the directors of Boeing, for the purposes of our 911 analysis, that is very important, is the late General John Shalikashvili. And the late General John Shalikashvili, he was, under the Clinton administration, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in 1997, an evil teacher, which I think is Bill Clinton, in my opinion, because he lectured in constitutional law, I think, at the University of Arkansas, with his wife, Hillary Clinton. But President Bill Clinton sent the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to China to address the People's Liberation Army generals at the military university in Beijing. And at the end of that speech, according to the transcript that may well have been scrubbed, yes, Mr. Sweigert, the word scrubbed does occur, and it is applied on embarrassing evidence, so maybe you can tell us about that one day. But the transcript that I saw said, according to the Shalikashvili speech, I've been instructed by my president, that's Bill Clinton, to leave behind details of all America's weapons programs. Now, I don't have to be American to believe that that is treason.
Yeah.
Now, when Shalikashvili, chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staff, immensely powerful position.
Son of a Nazi.
Yeah, come back to the son of actually a Waffen-SS general or major by the name of Dmitry Shalikashvili, who entered the United States when John Shalikashvili was 6 years old under, I believe, the British Operation Paperclip, where basically they massaged evidence of criminalities and brutal crimes on the Eastern Front and allowed these people to come into the United States and basically set up camp within the gates, if you will. Anyway, Shalik Ashfali, he comes back from that treasonous activity of handing over America's weapons secrets to the Communist Chinese, and he comes back to the United States and he becomes the director of Boeing. Well, think about that, folks. You've got the director of Boeing, who then apparently, using perhaps some of the material confiscated from Starnet Communications and taken south of the border into the United States, presumably in the custody of the Department of Justice, somehow extorts the directors, his fellow directors at Boeing, to move the headquarters of Boeing down to Chicago. And I believe Boeing headquarters was commissioned about 4 days before the 9/11 attack, leaving, of course, the directors, I don't know what the right phrase is, sucking air, because the directors only meet, let's say, every 3 months. The chief executive officer of Boeing, I think that's Scott McNarney or something like that, he's got a situation now where Boeing is obviously a key figure on the Federal Bridge, together with the other defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, and the French outfit EADS that makes Airbus. And so these are subject potentially to a revocation of the certificates through someone like David Sweigert in the middle of an exercise, like a continuity of government exercise. So can you imagine, Jason, you've got this Cornfield cruiser, which is a full facility that's able to track aircraft and was used to track civilian aircraft flying over New York on 911, that is able to inject a revocation instruction where Boeing, as a mentor of those war games, together with Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman, are revoked, have their certificates revoked, but their small business protege companies that operate inside the command structure of Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, they can be activated as part of the red team attacking the United States. So Boeing corporate is stood down, but Boeing proteges are stood up. And the blue team then goes blind, deaf, and dumb, which is what happened in Washington and New York. All of the defenders of the United States and the people inside the towers and that sort of thing, they lose their ability to communicate with each other. And let's say, hypothetically, the Sweigert red team has stood up and switched from foe to friend, such that, for example, Captain Gerald DeConto, the duty officer of the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center on 911, finds that there's a weapons platform heading his way, which is transmitting friend signals, which would be consistent with manipulation of the Howard Lemelson, what do they call it, friend or foe military expert system patent. And so he calls on the telephone, or whatever the communication system was, he calls the Secretary of the Navy.
Jerome Lemelson, right?
Yeah, Jerome Lemelson. He calls the Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England, asking for permission to override the software clamp on the missiles on the roof of the Pentagon, because the missiles on the roof of the Pentagon are treating the incoming as a friend. Right? Gordon England appears to have stalled Captain Gerald DeConto. So Captain Gerald DeConto takes a missile between the eyes, right? It was as accurate as that. 125 of his colleagues in the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center are killed, even obliterated, because I find no evidence of an autopsy. And we're back to Mr. Sweigert. The challenge for Mr. Sweigert, ex-Air Force, is can he explain what weapon might have tunneled through 8 reinforced walls of the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11 and blown 1.5 tons inside courtyard? And if he can't, can he explain why there's a team of people out on the Pentagon lawn wearing FBI T-shirts, taking evidence away, so we, the public, are deprived of the opportunity of saying that wasn't a Boeing passenger plane. That had to be, well, let me give a little guidance or suggestion to David G. Sweigert. Why don't you look up the Lockheed Martin rocket-boosted hardened penetrator pattern and see if the characteristics as described in the patent fit the tunnel through the Pentagon. Over to you, Jason.
Yeah, David, I mean, it's really compelling information that you share. And of course, there's these distraction tactics that are used. The opponents of this show, the people who don't want us discussing this information, would point out that I don't know anything about PKI and the Federal Bridge and all that. And they might even say that you don't. But the point is, that doesn't matter. We don't need to. We can find that information. We're simply pointing out that here's this infographic, and it's got all these links. I mean, I've said it before, we see a lot of seemingly unrelated entities on this thing. The Treasury, Entrust, EADS, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Entrust, NFI, the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense. I don't see Burger King on here. So there seems to be some relationship between each of these bodies, and it's defined by this document. Now, I don't need to know anything about the Federal Bridge. I don't need to know anything about neurosurgery. I could invite a neurosurgeon on the show and ask him questions about neurosurgery, and they would answer them. So as long as we possess an inquisitive mind and a healthy curiosity about these things, we don't need to be experts. We're putting this information out there, and responses come back, additional research is going on, and we're learning things. But what you've just pointed out is quite interesting. There's a missile defense system that protects the Pentagon from incoming aircraft and other threats. That makes sense. And there's a software program of some kind that you and I don't need to be experts in, but you've obviously done the research to learn that Captain DeCanto needed to override something that was happening with this software in order to activate the missiles. Well, David, it causes me to think about these pilots that were operating the systems on board the Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft that were also fighting with some sort of software override that was preventing them from having control of their technology that resulted in their death. That seems like a pattern match in those two situations, and certainly if someone were a hacker who had the ability to affect that software, they might be able to do something like that. We've heard about this Stuxnet virus, which existed on, well, I should say, was propagated through the Windows operating system, but actually targeted embedded circuits in centrifuges. Now, you've spoken about this gyro chip. What if something similar to the Stuxnet virus could somehow be injected into, I don't know, maybe the manufacturing process of that gyro chip? Or, I mean, again, I don't know. I don't need to know. We're just asking the question. And if this Federal Bridge infographic is describing a credit card processor or something like that, which frankly, David, is an analogy that doesn't hold up. It's partially accurate, but I don't think that that's a fully accurate analogy of what this is. Entrust, you know, there's a whole key card thing. There was a time where David George Sweigert's brother, George Webb Sweigert, was talking about some sort of relationship that David George Sweigert had with NATO generals in Luxembourg. I don't know anything about that other than what the two of them were arguing about online, but it seemed to agitate David quite a bit. And I wonder, you know, he worked for some card key access company. So here's the analogy that I've drawn, David. If this Federal Bridge Certification Authority, let's say we're talking about key cards to access a building. When you worked at Schlumberger, I would imagine that's the type of company that would have a high level of security because there's a lot of important stuff going on there. They don't want somebody going into an office, accessing a computer, and somehow screwing up an oil well or something like that. So it's tightly secured. And perhaps these nodes represent, you know, someone has card access to Raytheon, someone else has card access to Lockheed Martin. Well, if you were working for, let's say, the company that made those card keys like Entrust, Is it possible that you could devise some method of counterfeiting a card key and accessing an office at one of these companies or a computer network at one of these companies and doing something untoward once you gain that access? We're not suggesting that this is a network that describes high-speed information transfer like real-time video or anything like that. We're just saying there are things here that need to be better understood and are worthy of further investigation. Would you agree with that evaluation?
There's two kinds of networks that are at play here, right? Whether the network's the right term. There's the certificate issuing authority, the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, which issues certificates on technology basically developed by Nortel and Entrust. And so, for example, on the Federal Bridge, where you have Boeing is a giant company, so is Lockheed Martin. It's got many components to it. But one of the ways of reducing the integrity of these major defense contractors is tunneling into them. And for example, and we're back to Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister, forcing these companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, in order to get the big government contracts, they have to set aside a certain percentage of the size of the contract for what are known as small business administration 8A companies or protege companies.
Right.
Now here, like, if I may, maybe you can help me here, is I have facetiously, and I guess I'm being British and satirical, described an organization or a community of black one-legged lesbians. I'm being facetious, but if, according to Mr. Sweigert or his cronies, I'm really insulting and frightening the community of black one-legged lesbians. But what I'd like to do is issue an invitation, if there are any black one-legged lesbians out there that I might have offended or frightened, eventually, when we have the right sort of resources, I would like them to invite them to dinner with you and me at a restaurant of their choosing, and perhaps we could share some of the particular British humor. My point is, the point is there are vulnerable communities in every organization, including Veterans Affairs. And if those vulnerable communities are picked out for entrapment or blackmail or extortion, and then when they have turned, if that's the right word, they start sympathizing with the crime with passwords or certificates, and to get into sites, for example, the exercise on 911, possibly run out of that Cornfield carrier, which is staffed by the Navy and Lockheed Martin, and actually track aircraft off their regular en route airway into targets, right? Where the blue team is stood down through a hack, right? And the red team is then given access to super fast telemetry, for example, out of Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And that comes back to that extraordinary series of images taken from outside the Pentagon, where you can see something hitting the Pentagon, but it's not at all clear that it's a large passenger jet. And you have a date stamp and a time stamp. The date stamp, I think, is consistent with certificates issued to the people who have conspired to take out the Pentagon, which might be the associates of the Weathermen, you know, back from the 70s, because after all, they did bomb the Pentagon in 1972. So that has the date stamp 12th of September of 2001, which will be consistent with the date of Bill Clinton's stay at the Port Douglas Sheraton Mirage Hotel, because he's in Queensland and he has signed that plate. What is it? Bill Clinton, September the 11th, 2001, at the Salsa Bar and Grill, and I call that Bill Clinton's alibi plate.
Yeah.
So now what you've got is the red team, I'm suggesting hypothetically, is made up of protege companies classified according to racial orientation, sexual orientation, or ethnicity, or creed, or faith. And this is the group that is funded through the Small Business Administration loan program set up by Christine Marcy. And I don't see initially that they have any particular loyalty to the survival of the United States on 911. So it's highly likely for me that a group of Con Air SWAT teams and small business 8A protege teams conspired together, aided and abetted by this certificate issuing facility on the Federal Bridge, to take out the United States on 911. Over to you.
Yeah. You know, David, there's an amazing amount of troll activity. It's curious how cowards like to put in, you know, inaccurate comments and say stupid things. With sock puppet accounts, you and I, of course, present ourselves under our real names, our real credentials. It's really an interesting point of evidence to see how persistent these people are and what they try to do. I think that your process in revealing these patents and pointing out these networks and the various technologies, it's fascinating. And I think it's almost equally fascinating to see the resources and effort that go into trying to stop you and I, the number of lawsuits that have been brought, and I call them fake lawsuits, David, because they are based on lies. So it's not that they haven't actually been filed, and it's not that they haven't engaged real elements of the U.S. justice system. It's that they're based on falsehoods. That's what makes them fake. So, there's people who are watching right now who we know who they are, even though they're using these fake accounts and they're, persistently pushing the same ideas. The funny thing is, David, I think that all bullies operate under the same sort of premise. They intimidate and they rely on, sort of punching somebody once and scaring them away. And the longer you sort of force them to engage, the more you reveal how little they've actually got. And I think we're doing that to some extent today. We are running a bit short on time. Have we covered everything we wanted to discuss?
Well, I think so, but I do want to reiterate, going back to your collage, the importance of using the patent office to see if the description of the patent fits the signature at the crime scene. So what I think we're confronting, Jason, is a three-community tunneling process where the community, which basically is the center content of the Federal Bridge, is theoretically responsible for solving the crime because you've got the Department of Justice there. So in the United States, the Department of Justice should be interested in investigating crime, but very importantly, preserving the chain of custody of evidence and data, right, that allow that crime to be solved. Now, they're not doing that, whether it's through incompetence or malice or just, I don't know, it's not resulted in keeping enough evidence together to solve the crime. For example, Christine Marcy, who we've mentioned multiple times, used the Conair aircraft to fly evidence from the Murrah building bomb, where these vermin placed a bomb under the daycare center, right? To Washington to go into the FBI lab that to a very large extent at that time was controlled by Robert Hanssen, the most dangerous spy in America's history. So I believe Christine Marcy, my inference is that in taking that evidence away and quite possibly sending up the people to take evidence out of Starnet, she is guilty of spoliation of evidence. Right? Therefore, I'm making an inference that she is guilty of aiding and abetting the attack of 911. So that's one community, very important with that triple tunneling type process, is the community of social engineering that is engaged in scrubbing internet sites that they deem to be objectionable. There is the community of legitimate law enforcement and crime scene investigators, let's say loosely under the arm of the Department of Justice, where Christine Marcy, for a long period of time, was the senior counsel for the United States Marshal and in charge of the detention and deportation program of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. So I believe that what she has done is enable people to come into the country through the National Visa Center, operated by Serco, and embed themselves in these small business administration protege companies ready for the 911 attack. And then there's an element of the data at the crime scene that is spun off, particularly timestamp data, that would allow what you've told me is recognized in the language as a whitelist. I believe there is a whitelist of evil teachers or friends of evil teachers. That's the teachers that use the electronic visualization laboratory at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and that would include Obama and his wife, and Clinton's, and husband and wife. Mm-hmm. And what they can use is use the evil Batcave as a command and control center that is patched through with high-speed links to, for example, the Cornfield cruiser, that would allow you to hack into the aircraft on 911 and take them off their regular en route airway and fly them under the control of the missile gyroscope, the QRS-11, which operates at 40 cycles per second. Now, there's some evidence that's been scrubbed from the web about observers watching the missile across the Pentagon lawn, and they said the working surfaces were blurred, like it was moving, vibrating. Yeah. And that would be consistent of the use of the QRS-11 gyro chip and telemetry signals potentially coming from the control tower in Dubai that is actually moving the working surfaces of the missile so fast from the human eye's point of view, it looks like a blur. But you see, you can't afford at the speed of 500 miles an hour and 10 feet elevation with a large passenger jet to move the working surfaces by any significant amount, because they're going to get ripped off and the plane will be disintegrated through what's known as ground air turbulence. So back to Mr. Sweigert. Tell us, in your opinion, as an Air Force vet, what punched that tunnel through the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11 through 8 reinforced walls, and who sent the AMEC debris removal teams into the Pentagon and the Ground Zero in New York, where AMEC had been working on the upgrades to the diesel systems in building number 7. So AMEC had key contracts as prime contractor in New York and in the Washington Pentagon area, and also the contract for removing evidence, which is violating or breaking the chain of custody of evidence needed to solve the crime. Over to you, Mr. Sweigert.
I don't know if he'll respond, but of course he's been invited to. I want to also remind some of our viewers, there are, David, most of the people that view Crowdsource the Truth, and of course those that go to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, most of them are really highly inquisitive, extremely intelligent people, I would say above average, people who have realized that the mainstream news and large elements of the government, sometimes very well-funded elements of the government, such as the State Department's Global Engagement Center, they're really engaged in lying to us. And most people have realized that. There are some ignorant, corpulent morons watching from as far away as, say, Poland, who don't seem to realize that the things that you're saying aren't necessarily direct accusations, but hypotheses as to possible solutions to these unsolved crimes, or crimes in which the proposed solutions, such as 9/11, are generally unacceptable to large swaths of the population. I think most people do not believe that it's possible for humans to fly airplanes into certainly the South Tower. We've seen someone has created a computer recreation that indicates a course correction in the last 12 seconds of flight that's a perfect arch, which is not at all characteristic of human flight. It's more likely a programmed flight from something like the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot. And again, this doesn't suggest that we're accusing Boeing of doing this, but the amazing array of information that you've put together based on technologies that most people, including myself, were totally unfamiliar with, represent a very strong hypothesis or set of hypotheses for how these crimes could have been carried out. And we've invited all of these companies, all of these people, to examine the security of these systems, to think about why a skilled or allegedly skilled ethical hacker formerly employed by Antrust might have the ability to enable some of these things to happen, to put in place some of these circumstances that will allow these things to happen. And even in the case of Christine Marcy, I've called her on the phone several times. I believe it was her brother, Field McConnell, who gave me her phone number. And if we're wrong, I would be delighted to interview Ms. Marcy and learn more about this, because that's how this show works. We put out information and we don't claim to know the answers. We're looking for the answers, because these are troubling situations and troubling problems, and the fact that these crimes remain unsolved, or that the FBI or other members of the Department of Justice or the government are operating in ways that seem contradictory to standard practice. I think we have a right to know why these things have happened, and I think that our viewers want to know that. And I would remind people, David, you know, even though they only see you and I on YouTube and Periscope and Facebook and, of course, patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. For just a few hours a week, you and I are in regular communication, continuing our research. It's very time-consuming, and part of the goal of the people who have brought these lawsuits based on false claims is to, first of all, provide themselves with what they perceive as some sort of protection, where if they initiate a federal lawsuit on the basis of false claims and then consider themselves and other members of their network to be federal witnesses in those lawsuits, they can then claim that anything that we say about them is intended to intimidate a federal witness. But I would say that most of what they're doing is entirely fraudulent. It does succeed in occupying a lot of my time, which takes time away from other things that I would do to fund this operation, to conduct business as usual. So I do want to encourage viewers who are watching to please become sponsors, not just of Crowdsource the Truth, but also of David's Patreon page, which they can find at patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards. People can also follow David on Twitter by going to Twitter and just searching for @CSI Hawkins. David is posting regularly on Twitter. I want to thank you for joining me today, David, and also remind people of your fantastic website, which they can access for free. That's Reverse CSI Scripts. And I'll tell you, you know, this logo that you've designed, where it's a set of binoculars with one of the lenses turned around, it's us looking out for evidence, and this network of social engineers looking back at us. It becomes more and more relevant each week, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's an engineering concept called feedback, you see. So we need to modify our approach to unraveling these crimes. And I do believe it's worth introducing this concept of a common purpose, a common criminal purpose. And I think the people that we're up against, and we the people, just generally, the people of the free world, are up against a criminal organization that perhaps may be easily understood as a Con Air, patent for rent, murder for hire network that can engage the flight control systems of Boeing 737 MAX 8 and crash it in Indonesia or Ethiopia, and then arrange that the custody of the evidence that would allow people to understand that those planes had been hacked, or potentially explore the possibility that they'd been hacked, is actually broken. So they take the evidence, for example, to the BEA analytical lab in France, and so Boeing doesn't get to look at it. And BEA in France, in Toulouse, is in the backyard of EADS, that has a vested interest in destroying, or at least disempowering, Boeing. And EADS is represented in the World Trade Organization dispute with Boeing by the law firm Sidley Austin in Chicago, used to employ Bernadine Dohrn, the Weatherwoman,
and Michelle Obama.
And Barack Obama.
Unbelievable.
So the Weatherwoman, Bernadine Dohrn, groomed Barack and Michelle Obama for their journey to the White House and the ultimate subversion of the United States of America. Over to you.
I agree with you, David. And you know what? We would welcome any of these people to join us on the show and point out where we've got it wrong. But curiously, they don't seem to be doing that.
No, you're right, Jason. reluctant debutante, but their
Well,
day will come.
exactly. And you know, David, I think it's time for us to go, but I would definitely encourage people who are watching to sponsor the show and your Patreon site generously. I hope that people will do that so we can carry on, as so much time is dedicated to what we're doing here. I want to thank you for joining me today, David. We'll be back on Friday. And of course, if people are missing the exclusive shows, the subscriber-only shows that we put on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth, they're only getting a portion of the story. So now is a great time for people to subscribe to those pages and follow us each week. David, thank you so much for another fascinating program. I want to thank everyone for watching, and I'll see everybody soon.
Thank you, Jason. Bye now.